All right. Hi, everybody. We're going to launch into Chapter 12. So up to this point in the course, we've pretty much been talking about the pathogens. And at this point, we're going to kind of switch gears and go to the other side of that equation. So typically, a disease requires the host and pathogen interaction. And we're now going to start talking about the host portion of the host pathogen interaction. So chapter 12 begins to look at the immune system and all of the ways that we fight off pathogens. Okay, so our learning objectives are going to be summarize the 3 lines of host defenses, define what a marker is and discuss its importance in the second and third lines of defense out of those 3, name the body systems that participate in the immune system, describe the structure and function of the lymphatic system and its connection with the circulatory system. We're going to talk about 3 different types of blood cells that function in non-specific or innate immunity. We're going to connect the mononuclear phagocyte system to innate immunity, describe how T and B lymphocytes are involved in the specific or adaptive half of the immune system. And we're going to summarize the importance of cytokines and list both pro and anti-inflammatory cytokines. Okay, so let me take you back to the previous chapter. And again, here we were talking about the steps in the disease process. And the first part of that was finding a portal of entry. In other words, the microbe had to find some way into the body that was compatible with it being able to set up shop and start an infection. Once it got in, it has to attach. So if it gets flushed out, then obviously it's not going to be able to cause a disease. But in this case, it has to find a place that's compatible with forming a disease to attach. It then has to fight off whatever the host throws at it. So we're now going to start talking in more detail about what the host is going to do once it detects that a pathogen has started to set up shop. Assuming that the pathogen is successful in fighting off all of these things, in getting in attaching and fighting off the immune response, it's going to cause some kind of a disease. And typically that includes tissue damage. And at some point, it's going to exit the host in order to start the next infection. Okay, so that's kind of the scenario in which the immune system is going to be playing its part. Okay, so host defenses are a multi-level network of responses, okay? And they include both specific and non-specific responses. So there are really 2 halves of the immune system. The innate or non-specific is the more general of the 2 of them. They don't fight off a particular pathogen. They just know enough about what pathogens do that they can recognize patterns and fight that off. Then there is the adaptive or specific half of the immune system, and this is one that goes after a particular pathogen. So it's not going to look for any sign of any kind of virus. It's going to fight off the measles virus, as an example. So we talk about 3 different lines of defense. Okay, the first line of defense is essentially a barrier. Okay, so it's any barrier that blocks invasion at the portal of entry. So here, you're not even fighting off the particular pathogen, you're just simply not letting it get in there in the first place. It limits access to the internal tissues of the body. It is not normally considered a true immune response because it really doesn't involve the recognition of any foreign substances. It's basically intact skin, nothing's going to get in unless it can burrow into the skin itself. And of course, it's a very general kind of defense, so an awful lot of things are going to set up shop on the outside of our skin, and they aren't going to cause disease because that's obviously stopping it from gaining access to the body itself. The other 2 lines of defense, which we're going to talk about a little bit later. So the second line of defense is a set of cells and fluids that actually start to protect the body against the pathogen itself. So let's say the pathogen has gotten in, the flu virus gets in through the nose. There are some very generalized immune system cells. We've sort of mentioned them in the past, things like macrophages, dendritic cells, neutrophils, things that are just looking for those patterns that pathogens have that are not specific to any one particular pathogen. And there are also some generalized responses, so things like inflammation. And in part, what inflammation is trying to do is trying to localize that pathogen and not let it get further access into the body. So if you get a splinter and the fingertip swells, that's sort of cutting off a lot of the blood vessels that might allow that pathogen to gain access. And so once it's kind of localized that pathogen in the tip of your finger, then we can start sending in the white blood cells and all of the specific things that the immune system is going to try to do to fight off that pathogen. And it acts both locally and also at the systemic level. So once that first line of defense has been breached, then these other second line of defense mechanisms start kicking into place. And the third line of defense is that second half of the immune system, where we're talking about a very specific immune response to a very particular pathogen, okay? And it's acquired one at a time. So when you're first exposed to a particular pathogen and you build up that immune response, the body learns how to deal with that particular pathogen. Whether that's through immunization, whether that's through actually getting the disease, it just kind of learns how to fight that off. And each different microbe is going to produce a very different set of responses. So whether it's going to fight it with antibodies, whether it's going to fight it with T cells that are actually going to go in and kill the host cell that's been infected, all of that is dependent on the specific pathogen and then the body's specific response to that pathogen. The benefit is in that second half of the immune system, you can get long-term immunity. Okay, so you can become immune to that particular pathogen. So either having chickenpox or being vaccinated for chickenpox will allow you to get long-term immunity from the chickenpox virus. Okay, so again, I mentioned that there are two halves of the immune system. This particular chapter is going to focus on the left half of this chart, the innate or non-specific part of the immune system. Okay, and so we're going to mostly be talking about the first and second line of defense in this chapter. The acquired immune system we're going to cover more thoroughly in the next chapter. We're going to mention it because there are connections between the innate and the adaptive immune system. There's a handshake and kind of a handoff of information. Once the innate immune system kind of deals with the pathogen right when it first infects, then it's going to hand it off to that more specific immune system, and that's going to mount the real big immune response to the particular pathogen. So we mentioned the first line of a defense, and the first line of defense really is a barrier of some sort. So it consists of things like physical barriers, so intact skin. It also contains the microbiome. So again, we've talked about the microbiome just literally taking over the real estate and not allowing any place for an invading pathogen to be able to attach. Okay, so that's actually part of the first line of defense. And we also have chemical barriers. So for example, in tears, we have certain proteins that tend to fight off particular pathogens. We have stomach acid. So if we eat a pathogen in our food, it has to get past that highly acid barrier. And then the next thing that happens is it gets dropped into the small intestine, which is highly alkaline. So it has to deal with really broad ranges of pH. And so that's considered a chemical barrier. Again, so those are really nonspecific. Okay, the second line of defense is going to start getting a little more particular about pathogens. Okay, and there are certain kinds of things that are provided in that second line of defense. So, phagocytosis we have talked about a little bit. So this is, for example, a macrophage eating a bacteria, and after it eats it, it digests it, it chops it up, and clears the body of that. Inflammation is a nonspecific response, but it is a response to the invasion by a pathogen. And again, swelling, heat, all those sorts of things that you would think about with inflammation. fever is also a nonspecific response, and it just simply makes it uncomfortable for the bacteria to be able to grow, and it also increases the activity of our own enzymes. So fever will make the enzymes act a little bit faster, but once you get past a certain temperature, then you start to denature proteins. And of course, enzymes are proteins. And so you actually then start doing damage to the whole response. And obviously, you start doing damage to the tissues as well. And antimicrobial products, whether those are provided by, for example, the microbiome producing antimicrobials, or you're talking about an antibiotic that we take and that would then kill that off. Okay. Okay, so as I said before, this is a network of responses, and a lot of these defenses overlap and they're redundant. And the whole idea is if you have a pathogen that's trying to set up shop, you want to throw everything that you have at it. And if it gets past one defense, you want another one right behind it to be able to stop it from being able to cause disease. Okay, so each of these individual responses, whether it's a chemical response, whether it's a physical response, whether it's a cell trying to eat it, whatever that is, when you add them all together, it makes the survival of that invading organism much less likely. Okay. At this point, I want to bring up the subject of immunology. So that is the study of the immune system, and it really focuses on the body's second and third lines of defense. So that includes things like macrophages, that includes all of those innate immune responses, as well as the adaptive or specific immune responses, the B cells and the T cells. It looks at the body's response to various infectious agents. In other words, what kind of a response is the body going to mount? So in some cases, producing antibodies is the best option. If you have an intracellular parasite, antibodies are no good because it can't get to it. It's inside of one of our cells. And so that would be a T cell or that sort of a response. So again, we're studying what is it for a particular pathogen that would lead our body to choose one of those two responses, and is that appropriate given the particular pathogen. And it also studies things like allergies, which is basically an overreaction of the immune system to some kind of a stimulus, and cancer, which typically is an underreaction of the immune system. So why is it that we have this thing that's invading our body, but our immune system doesn't seem to be able to deal with it or clear it? Okay. Okay. So a healthy immune system is basically responsible for a number of things in the body. So the first thing is we have these cells, these macrophages, whose job it is to kind of float around in the bloodstream and in some of the immune organs like the spleen and like lymph nodes and all the variety of different places in the body. And they're just basically looking for bad guys. Again, they're looking for those molecular patterns. They're not looking for a particular pathogen. They're looking for a class of pathogens. Once it recognizes that foreign body, then it has to deal with it. So it's going to destroy it, or it's going to do a handshake with the the specific immune system in order to be able to fight off that disease. Okay, so as I said, the white blood cells, things like macrophages, things like neutrophils, are going to be constantly moving throughout the body looking for pathogens, okay? It is basically looking for something which has markers of being non-self, okay? So the body is trained to recognize its own cells based on what's on the outside of the cells. And so they have to be able to differentiate those non-self things which they want to deal with versus self, which they don't want to disturb. Okay. And the ability to look at self molecules and not destroy them is a really critical piece of the immune system. But every once in a while, the immune system gets a little confused, and that is referred to as an autoimmune disease, where for some reason or another, the body has decided that one of our own cells is a problem and then attacks it. Okay. So the immune system looks for those self signals by looking at surface molecules that are referred to as antigens or markers. Okay, and those markers consist primarily of either proteins or sugars, or what are referred to as glycoproteins, which are basically a protein with a sugar attached to it. And the body has been trained to know what kinds of proteins and sugars belong in our own body tissues. And so it learns not to attack that. Okay, if a cell, such as a bacteria, has different kinds of markers on the outside, then all of a sudden the macrophages know, that's not part of our body, we need to attack that and clear it. Okay, and the most common method of doing that is by phagocytosis, which is where the macrophage wraps around the bacteria, pulls it inside, and then digests it. So we've talked a little bit about these markers. So there are basically the sorts of things that you tend to find on a bacterium which you do not find on human cells. So for example, human cells do not have flagella. So if you find something with a flagellum, that's not self. And so one of those molecular patterns that our immune system is trained to look for are things like fimbriae, which is made out of a protein called pillin. They look for flagella, which is made from a protein called flagellin. And those are molecular markers that the immune system is going to recognize. And it does that because all of the immune system cells have these pattern recognition receptors. Okay, so it's going to go around and kind of sample cells. And as long as it has the kind of markers that are not associated with bacteria and viruses and things like that, it's going to move on. But all of a sudden, if it starts finding flagellin, it's going, okay, this is a pathogen. This is not something that belongs in our body. Okay, so those pattern recognition receptors are used by those host immune cells in the innate recognition of pathogens. Okay, so it's part of that second line of defense, and its purpose is to recognize those pathogen-associated molecular patterns, those proteins and sugars that do not belong to our body. Okay. So the immune system is really distributed throughout our body. It does not exist in a single well-defined place. So it's a large, complex, diffuse network of cells, like white blood cells, and fluids, like lymph, that permeate every single organ and every tissue. Okay, and that allows the body to kind of keep an eye on things throughout the entire body. So it allows surveillance and recognition that helps the body look for and then just deal with and destroy those harmful substances like bacteria. Okay, so in order for the immune response, uh, they have to be able to communicate. So once, for example, a bacterium is located, say, in the tip of your finger, the immune cells that recognized that infection need to be able to communicate with the rest of the immune system to be able to send more white blood cells to, whatever it is that it needs to do. Okay, so these mononuclear phagocytes, which are these white blood cells that are going to be able to clear that infection, are in direct contact with tissue and also that extracellular fluid. Okay, so they are going to be able to detect that a bacterial infection, for example, has occurred, and then they're going to be able to send signals through that extracellular fluid to be able to cause more white blood cells to arrive. Sometimes it's going to do some of those other nonspecific things like cause inflammation, cause a fever, all of those sorts of things. And it's able to do that because it has access to both the blood, the circulatory system, as well as the lymphatic system. And both of those are fluids that are able to carry these chemical messages from one part of the body to another. And those chemicals that originate in that mononuclear phagocyte system and the extracellular fluid then diffuse throughout the body in order to send those signals and to call whatever cells are being requested to come. Okay. So the lymphatic system is actually kind of a parallel system to the circulatory system. So you'll typically find lymph vessels literally laying alongside the blood vessels, but it's separate. Okay, they are separately compartmented, and it's a separate network of vessels, of cells, and of specific organs. So we're familiar with things like the lymph nodes. Okay, so that is basically where the lymph drains into and where a lot of the surveillance of the body takes place. So in those lymph nodes, there are typically a lot of macrophages, and they're able to fight off these bacteria locally in the lymphatic system. Um, and these lymph vessels are able to transport lymph through an increasingly larger tributary system. Okay, so again, very much like the circulatory system, where you have these big arteries and then they break down into smaller arterioles and then they break down into these little capillaries. A similar sort of thing exists in the lymphatic system. And again, it literally lays alongside the blood vessels. And so it's distributed throughout the entire body, and it's able to process lymph fluid. Okay. Okay, so here is an example of the lymphatic system next to the circulatory system. Okay, and it will show you that there is a lymph pathway that is literally parallel to the circulatory pathway as well. And again, all of these lymph nodes are draining into these, the lymphatic vessels are draining into these lymph nodes where an awful lot of surveillance is taking place inside the body. Okay, so the purpose of the lymphatic system is to provide a route for the return of a lot of extracellular fluid to the circulatory system. So the lymph actually pulls a lot of the extracellular fluid in, runs it through the lymph node, and that cleaned out lymph fluid is ultimately dropped back into the circulatory system, minus all of the bacteria and cellular crud that the lymph system is basically collecting up. So this is part of why, after a couple of days of having an inflammatory response, the swelling is going to go down. All of the fluid that's involved in that inflammatory response is going to be drained off by the lymph system and ultimately returned to the circulatory system. Okay, and by having this sequence of lymph nodes, this is, again, how a lot of that surveillance is able to take place. Things are pulled into the lymph system, they're run through the lymph nodes, lots of macrophages are there, they're cleaned out, things are cleared, so the bacteria are cleared, the cellular debris is cleared, and the lymph system, the lymph fluid is ultimately returned into the circulatory system, cleaned out. Okay, so that lymphatic fluid is basically very similar in many ways to plasma. Okay, it is formed when certain blood components are moved out of the blood vessels and into that extracellular space in between the cells of the body. And that fluid then migrates into the lymph capillaries, because that's the purpose, is the lymph capillaries basically are there to pull excess fluid out of the body. There are tons of white blood cells in that lymphatic fluid, again, doing the surveillance. It also transports things like fats, cellular debris. So once, cells die off and they're kind of cleaned out by the circulating macrophages, they're dumped into the lymph system where they're able then to be cleaned out. And in some cases, pathogens are able to get into the lymphatic system and use that same network to be able to distribute themselves. Okay. Hopefully the macrophages are going to clean them out, but if they're not successful, that unfortunately is another method that pathogens are able to use to distribute themselves inside the body. Okay. As I said, you have a parallel set of lymphatic vessels. They are very similar to thin-walled veins. Okay, they run right alongside all of the blood vessels, from the capillaries all the way up to the really big arteries and veins. They extend into all parts of the body except for the central nervous system. The walls are very easily permeated by extracellular fluid because essentially that's the job of the lymphatic system, is to drain fluid out of the body. Um, and the lymph systems are found in very high numbers in the extremities, the hands and feet, and also around the breast tissue. Lymph flows from the extremities back to the heart. Okay, so again, you're heading back into the circulatory system. And it doesn't have its own set of pumps. So unlike the circulatory system, which has a really big, massive pump right in the middle of it that sends the blood out into the rest of the tissues, the lymph is only moved by muscular movements. So one of the reasons that a lot of people like to do rebounding is apparently that is really good for getting the lymph moving. Walking is also an excellent way of getting the lymph moving throughout the body. But if you're stable, the lymph isn't moving, it's just staying there. Okay, so the lymphatic organs include sites of immune cell birth and maturation, which mostly includes the red bone marrow. So that's typically at the end of the large bones, and also the thymus, which is a really, really small little organ. And its job is to basically mature T cells. So T cells are short for thymus cells, so that's its purpose. The secondary lymphatic organs are also an important part of this, and that includes things like the lymph nodes, the spleen, and various different lymphoid tissues scattered throughout the body. Okay, so I had mentioned the red bone marrow. This is the place where most blood cells of all forms are created. That is called hematopoiesis, and that is the formation of all the different kinds of blood cells. That is a really important intersection between the circulatory system, the skeletal system, and the lymphatic system. Okay, all of the long bones have a matrix that includes this red bone marrow. So, and it's the site of all blood cell production, red and white. So, after, for example, B lymphocytes, B cells, begin to express B cell markers, so they start to behave more and more like B cells, they complete their maturation inside the bone marrow, and then they move out to the lymph organs. And again, they're part of that surveillance system. Once certain things start to happen, they wake up and they start producing antibodies to go after that particular pathogen that's been detected in the body. Okay, so the thymus is basically the site of some of those immune cell maturation. It originates in the embryo, in that lower neck region, and then it fuses to become the more mature thymus. Those T lymphocytes that are produced in the bone marrow are referred to as naive. Basically, they're clones of all the other basic T cells, and they do not yet know how to go after a particular pathogen. That whole process of maturation of the T cells from that almost stem cell-like T cell into something that could actually kill a particular pathogen, all of that is occurring inside the thymus. And the T cells are then released into the circulating blood system and the lymph system as mature T cells that are going to go after a particular pathogen. Okay, a lot of the T cells eventually migrate into those lymph nodes and the spleen, which are kind of those central immune system places where everything kind of gets passed through those organs and the surveillance is able to happen. Okay, so here is a picture of a lymph node. So we've talked about that as one of the places that this immune surveillance occurs. It's a small bean-shaped like organ, and they are clustered all over the body and in particular certain places. So they're all along those lymphatic channels next to the large blood vessels, and they're very heavily populated in the thoracic and abdominal cavities. And they also are highly populated in the armpit in the groin, right, where your legs come together, and also in the neck. Okay, so one of the reasons that people feel along in here as part of your exam is that there are a ton of lymph nodes right there. And enlargement of those lymph nodes can provide a really important sign for the doctor that something infectious is going on because the lymph system has been activated. Okay, the spleen is another really important immune system or lymphatic organ. It's found in the upper left portion of the abdominal cavity, kind of opposite the liver, and it serves as a filter for blood instead of lymph. Okay, so again, you've got kind of parallel surveillance systems going on. Um, One of the reasons why your spleen has to be removed if you have a very, very serious traumatic injury to the thorax is because it has so much blood in it that you can bleed out very rapidly if you don't get that spleen bleeding under control. Its main job is to remove red blood cells that are worn out. So when they've, again, red blood cells have no nucleus, and so once the nucleus is ejected from it as part of the maturation process of the red blood cell, it has a finite lifespan. And so when it hits the end of that finite lifespan, it's pulled out by the spleen, and the hemoglobin is then recycled into the next set of red blood cells. The spleen also filters pathogens from the blood, and it has a ton of macrophages in there that are there for surveillance and to deal with the blood that's going through the spleen. Adults who have had their spleen removed can live a fairly normal life, but children who have no spleen are really immunocompromised. Okay, they don't have that full set of memory cells available to them from having been exposed to all of these different pathogens, and so that can really have a huge impact on their ability to fight off disease. And the last thing the spleen does is it stores blood. And so if you have some kind of a traumatic injury somewhere else in the body, it can actually release the blood into the bloodstream to be able to supplement that which is being lost. So there are also things called associated lymphoid tissues, and these are discrete bundles of lymphocytes that hang out on or just beneath the skin and mucosal surfaces. So these are kind of poised, ready to attack. Okay, so it basically allows a first strike potential in places that are constantly under assault by pathogens. Okay, so skin. If you get a break in the skin, there's going to be immune tissue that's right there, ready to pounce. Mucosa, again, most of our mucosal surfaces are essentially open to the outside world, and this is one of the main portals of entry for a lot of pathogens. And then the last set of associated lymphoid tissues are the gut-associated lymphoid tissue, or GALT. And that includes things like the appendix, the lacteals, and a group of cells called Pear's patches inside the small intestine. And this is basically a little immune system area that's going to be surveilling the food that's going through to make sure that we don't have pathogens that are entering through the gut, and we have lymph tissue ready to attack in case they find that. And the last one, of course, we've already talked about a little bit, are the tonsils. And that's a source of lymphocytes right there in the pharynx. And again, all of the bacteria that are coming in through the air that we breathe, are dealt with by the tonsils and all of the related lymph tissues there. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about blood. So whole blood consists of a number of components. So the first part, obviously, is the red blood cells, or blood cells, both white and red. And those are basically suspended in the plasma, which is the liquid of blood. And that's a clear yellowish fluid. So if you've ever seen blood spun down so that all the red blood cells go to the bottom of the tube, what's left is the plasma, and that's a pretty clear, slightly yellowish liquid, and that's the liquid component of the blood. Serum is essentially the same as plasma, except basically all of those clotting factors have been removed. So this is just the liquid minus all those clotting factors. Okay. And I mentioned a word prior to this. It's called hematopoiesis, and that is the process of producing red blood cells. So there are some other cell types that we should talk about that are components of the blood. Stem cells actually are things that live in the marrow, and these are the precursors to all the new blood cells that are produced by the bone marrow. Okay, so during development, those stem cells divide, and then they go through a maturation process, which makes them more and more differentiated into whatever the end result of that blood cell is going to be. So if it goes down the red blood cell path, it goes through one set of maturation steps. If it's going to the white blood cell path, it goes through a different set of maturation steps. And there are multiple types of white blood cells, and each one of those has a different set of steps that it has to go through. Okay. White blood cells are also referred to as leukocytes, and they have one or two basic forms. One of them is the granulocyte, okay? And basically, granulocytes versus agranulocytes were differentiated simply by looking at stained white blood cells. And if it had granules, it was a granulocyte, and if it did not have granules when it was stained, it was an agranulocyte. But again, there are different maturation processes, and these two types of cells do have different jobs in the immune system. Okay, and they are vitally important to both non-specific as well as specific immunity. So these blood cells are what actually do the handshake or the handoff of information from that innate immune response to the specific or adaptive immune response. So without these white blood cells doing that handshake, that handover could never happen, and the specific immune system will not wake up. Okay, so I want you to spend a little bit of time looking at this diagram in your book, okay, and sort of following all of the different pathways into the different types of white blood cells mostly, okay? Okay, now I mentioned that the immune system needs to form a certain type of communication. Okay, so there are a number of chemicals that are produced by some of these white blood cells whose purpose is simply to communicate with the rest of the immune system. And again, those signals are put into the blood, they're put into the lymph, they're spread throughout the body through all of those vascular mechanisms. So basically, there are lots and lots of cytokines, hundreds and probably thousands of cytokines, and they do all sorts of things. They can regulate the immune system, they can stimulate it, they can call immune cells, they can say, okay, we're done with dealing with the infection, everybody, slow down, stop dividing, stop going after it, we're done. And lots of different things. They can be inflammatory, they can basically start an inflammatory response locally. They are produced by a variety of the different white blood cells, so monocytes, macrophages, lymphocytes, fibroblasts, mast cells, platelets, as well as endothelial cells, which are basically inside skin cells. So all of those inner skin cells around and in our tissue, many of those are able to produce cytokines as well. And they can be local, so if they're just secreting, not sending it into the bloodstream, they can have a local effect, or it can be systemic. If that cytokine ends up in the bloodstream and gets sent to the entire rest of the body, then it can be a systemic response. It can be short term, so it's just sort of, okay, everybody's come on over here now and deal with this infection, or it can be long term. It can actually say, okay, we've got this ongoing situation here, and it continues to secrete these same signals. It can be very specific, like inflammation here, or it can be very non-specific. It's sort of, okay, macrophages, get ready to start looking for bacteria. And it can be protective, or it can be part of that autoimmune system response. Okay, so where the body actually starts attacking itself. So you can have a cytokine that wakes up macrophages to go after our own tissue, and that's a bad sort of thing to happen. Okay, so here are some examples of cytokines, and again, we're not going to go into any of these things specifically. This is its own semester course, and I have actually been asked to tell you that there is an immunology class that is available through the School of Nursing. I believe it's taught by Dr. French, who you've met, and it's an entire semester on all of these different activities in the immune system, and the immune system is just absolutely fascinating, so I'd really encourage you to consider that class. But again, we have pro-inflammatory cytokines, we have anti-inflammatory cytokines, we have things that cause vessels to dilate or to constrict, depending on what's needed for a particular response. We have growth factors that make cells divide. We have cytokines that activate or deactivate various different blood cells. So spend a little bit of time. I don't believe you're going to be asked any of these particular cytokines, but you may be asked about cytokines in general. So maybe look at that left-hand column and see the kinds of things that cytokines will do. Okay. So we also have another part of the tissue called the reticulum, and it is a supportive network of connective tissue that permeates all of the tissues in our body, and it interconnects nearby cells and basically forms a network of connected tissue that surrounds all of our different organs. Okay, and we have phagocytes basically built into that reticulum all around the outsides of all of our organs. Okay, again, that whole system together is referred to as the mononuclear phagocyte system. They're calling it MPS. Okay, so that basically is a place where macrophages can hang out. They have a place to hold on to with all of these connective fibers to be able to do their surveillance job. Okay, and again, that is co-located with all of these lymph nodes, these groups of lymph nodes. So, basically up in the chest, by the neck, in the abdomen, down at the groin, and armpits, and other places where you tend to have quite a bit of lymph tissue. Okay, so that mononuclear phagocyte system that we just talked about are found in some very specific organs, in addition to wrapping around a lot of the other organs in the body. So the thymus is, again, a very, very critical part of the immune system. The lymph nodes, like we just talked about, the tonsils, the spleen, and all of that lymphoid tissue that we talked about, the salt, the galt, all of that. And it's loaded with these white blood cells called macrophages that are basically doing the surveillance, and they are part of the innate response that destroys bacteria as they arrive in these surveillance locations. Okay, so we're going to do a concept check. Lymphatic fluid contains all of the following except, and the answer is red blood cells. So it contains white blood cells, it contains that extracellular fluid, because that's part of what the lymph system does, is it drains fluid from the other tissues. It will contain cellular debris, and that's part of the cleansing process, so it goes into the lymph system and is dealt with by the macrophages. And occasionally it will contain infectious agents like bacteria or viruses. Okay,